The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center webinar. Today, we are going to learn all about opportunities to develop bicycle networks and build out bike networks by taking advantage of road resurfacing and maintenance activities. With limited budgets available to implement recommendations in our bicycle plans, communities really struggle with how to fund and get these projects implemented. And our panelists are going to lay out today a strategy that will allow you to incorporate bike projects into these other ongoing efforts. My name is Dan Jeline. I work here at the Highway Safety Research Center and the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center. I will be facilitating the webinar today, and I'd like to go ahead and introduce you to each of the panelists joining us today. First, we're going to be hearing from Becky Crow, who serves as a transportation specialist in the Federal Highway Administration's Office of Safety. Becky manages 2 Everyday Counts initiatives focused on both road diets and safe transportation for every pedestrian or step. She'll be providing an overview of this topic for FHWA. Peter Lagerway is a senior planner for Tool and has over 30 years experience managing high-profile pedestrian and bicycle projects and programs with both the City of Seattle and as a consultant. Jeremy Charzan is a senior engineer with more than 15 years experience in transportation engineering, specializing in many areas, including bicycle and pedestrian transportation. Tool Design Group developed a workbook on this topic and has been working on, and Pete and Jeremy have been involved in developing and leading a training based on the workbook to really help agencies develop this process to incorporate bicycle projects into resurfacing efforts. So we're really glad to have them here today, and Becky Crow has been overseeing that effort from FHWA, and we're glad to have her with us as well. We're hoping we can get right into the material here, but I do have a few things I wanted to cover just before we get into the webinar presentation. I'd like to ask the attendees first, if you can hear me, if you'll please raise your hand. There's a hand arrow or icon located in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. If you raise your hand, that'll let me know that my sound is coming through loud and clear. Great, I see the hands going up. Appreciate that. Thanks for joining us today, everybody. If for whatever reason your computer freezes during the webinar, please just reload the website and log back into the program. You should just be able to rejoin the session. Please note that as attendees, you won't be able to speak during the webinar, but you will have the ability to submit questions and comments to us using the chat function located in the GoToWebinar control panel. You can ask those questions at any time, and we're planning to hold about 25 to 30 minutes for a discussion period after the presentation. We've already posted a copy of the presentation slides on our webinar archive page, and I'll be sending that link out through the chat pod shortly here. We are going to be posting a recording of this webinar on our PBIC website. It should be up either later today or tomorrow, early tomorrow, so you should be able to look back at anything you missed. Later today, you're going to be receiving a follow-up email from the UNC Highway Safety Research Center with a link that's going to allow you to generate a certificate of attendance for this webinar. So it's important that if you're attending the webinar with multiple attendees at your site, you want to make sure you forward that message on to the others who are attending with you so that they can also generate your certificate or their certificate of attendance. The webinar today has been submitted to the American Planning Association to be considered for 1.5 CM credits. I'd encourage you to please check the online AICP event calendar for more information about that. I wanted to just share a brief bit of information here with you about how you can find more information about our webinars. We post all of our webinars at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. You can stay up to date with us on social media, both Twitter and Facebook. We're at pedbikeinfo. We're actually going to be talking about this webinar today using hashtag PBICwebinar if you want to join in on that. And then if you want to just receive some emails from us when we put new webinars together, you can sign up for our mail at pedbikeinfo.org/signup. We do have one webinar coming up next week that I wanted to let people know about. It's on a very similar topic, all about how we measure and visualize our multimodal network. So we're going to have a great panel here for that one as well. So that's next Wednesday at the same time. So if you're interested, you can visit pedbikeinfo.org/webinars to learn more and get registered. Before we get into the presentations today, I do want to take just a quick poll, as we usually do. We just want to numbers of people that are out there listening to the webinar today. So if you can let us know if it's just you behind your computer screen, or if you've got 2 or 3 people, 4 or 5, or maybe even a larger group, we're interested in learning more about how people are attending attending and viewing our webinars. So we'll probably leave this poll open for about another 10 seconds or so to get you a chance to submit your vote, and then we'll move right along with our presentation today. Okay, just a few more seconds on the poll question before we go ahead and get started. Great. All right, thank you all so much. Really appreciate that. I'm going to not waste any more time. I'll close that poll up, and I'll send things right over to our first panelist. So Pete, you should see that screen come across if you want to take control and go full screen with your slides. Okay.
Okay.
I can see your slide. And Becky, if you want to go ahead and kick us off then.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. This webinar is timely. We're celebrating Bike Month, and today is Bike to School Day. So I hope some folks on the phone today and on the webinar got a chance to celebrate Bike to School Day. So between February and April of this year, we have provided 15 trainings on our workbook to MPOs. We went out and worked with those states that actually wanted to institutionalize road diets. So we got a lot of great feedback, and we decided we wanted to share the material to a larger audience through this webinar. So I really appreciate PBIC for partnering with us to make this happen. I know repaving is going to get started in a lot of areas. I'm here in Virginia, and I know we're going to get started soon. So I really hope the information that's shared today, it can help you work with your partners to, you know, increase bicycle accommodations during that resurfacing process. So I encourage you to take a look at the resources that we share, and if you have any questions or need additional information on this information or road diets, please reach out to me. So Pete, I'm going to turn it over to you, but welcome and have a great webinar.
Well, thank you, Becky, and thank you, Dan. And again, this is just our contact information. I'm going to be doing the first half. Jeremy will be doing the second half. And just a little background. In terms of the overall objective for our time today, we want to really get an understanding of how to integrate bicycle facilities into routine surfacing programs. And as was mentioned, it's quite often we don't always have funds to put in bike facilities as special projects. But whenever you do repavement, there's an opportunity to get put in bicycle facilities simply because you have to do the restriping. And so there's sort of a couple different things that we'll talk about today. I'm going to be focusing on the process and timeline, and then Jeremy will be talking about effective methods for actually implementing these different kinds of bike facilities. So here's the agenda. The resurfacing process and timelines, again, which I'll cover. Jeremy will cover the road diets and other methods for including bikeways, and then we're going to touch on cost and material considerations. I just want to refer you to the lollipops on the right side, and this works really well when we have in-person workshop. But what I like to do is to suggest that think of when you were 11 years old, and think of when you where you lived when you were 11, and at that time, were you allowed to walk alone and go to the grocery store or whatever and get a lollipop and come home alone? Was that something that you were able to experience when you were a child about 11? Then I would ask that you jump forward, and let's just assume right now where you live, and assume that you have an 11-year-old. Would you allow your 11-year-old to walk to the store to get a lollipop walking alone? And quite often when I have people raise hands, we find that there's a real loss of the ability of kids to navigate their neighborhoods and to go to the store on their own. And so it's just a way of really bringing home the importance of creating both bikeable and walkable communities, and think of it, does it sort of pass the lollipop test? Now, I always use it on an 11-year-old because at about 11, kids have the cognitive ability to cross a street. In other words, they can measure their own walking speed or bicycling speed, and they can compare that to the closing distance of, say, 2 lanes of traffic and motor vehicles coming, and do the math and get across the street. And of course, that is different for every child, but it's just an average. And it's also partly why we see kids on bicycles, and I'm just going to mention pedestrians on just a couple of these, overrepresented in the crash data at a younger age. And then, of course, we see the seniors overrepresented in the crash data, again, at the other end, because some of that ability to do that process and get across the street becomes a little bit diminished. So we see some similar patterns at both ends of the age spectrum. And I just like to frame it a little bit, because really what we're talking about in all of this is safety. We really want to reduce the number of crashes involving bicyclists. So I'm going to talk about the process and timeline. And in some ways, I think this is the most difficult part. We have a lot of good guidance on design and how to do things, and it's very important. But the process and timeline can be particularly challenging, especially since every community has a slightly different way of approaching it, and getting your arms around it and figuring out exactly how to do this can be a challenge. So we're going to take you through some steps that will hopefully allow you to figure it out for your community and really start to institutionalize bike projects into resurfacing projects. Resurfacing defined is always a bit tricky, because there's so many new different products out there. There's overlays, there's microsurfacing, there's new materials out. And so for purposes of our conversation today, we're going to describe resurfacing as anything you do to a street where when you're done, you've got to repaint the lines. So we'll just keep it very, very simple like that. We're also going to assume that the curbs don't move and the shoulders don't change. In other words, curb to curb, what's there, it's getting resurfaced in however way we would define that, but something that means that you're going to repaint it. And whenever you repaint a street, there's an opportunity to do something for bicycling. And again, every community uses different definitions, and you'll have to provide sort of your own definition in this. But for purposes of just doing the presentation, I'm widely dividing resurfacing into sort of 2 halves. One is sort of operation pavement maintenance. These are the annual programs typically where you do overlays and you resurface streets. And they're called different names, but you get the idea. And then the capital projects, these are like the 6-year big capital projects where we're completely rebuilding a street, possibly widening a street, maybe a new street, and a whole different kind of timeline. Not talking about capital projects today. Capital, this we call them CIP, a lot of different names. We're talking more of the operations and pavement maintenance, the things that we typically do on an annual basis, putting a new surface on a street. One of the things that always comes up is, what triggers ADA, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on ADA this morning, but just to say that whenever you're doing a resurfacing that is going through the area where people cross the street, it's going to trigger ADA. In other words, when you do a resurfacing, you're going to have to redo the ramps and make sure that you have the companion ramp and that it really works for, it meets ADA requirements. So when communities get in trouble, it's usually because they're not being aggressive enough in terms of meeting ADA and trying to sort of fine-tune, well, this is sort of official resurfacing, this isn't. Anytime that you're putting a resurfacing down, however you want to define it, and you're putting back the paint, you're going to trigger ADA. And just assume you're going to do this, and it's going to be part of what you do. So this is a typical process, and whenever when I was working on this, whenever you start putting little boxes together and showing a process, you realize it probably doesn't exactly fit for any one community or transportation agency. But I think it gives you a sense of how this is done, and you'll have to sort of adjust your thinking in terms of how your agency does this. But I think it's good for purposes of discussion and the point we're trying to make. So I'm just going to walk through this because I think this is particularly important. Typically, there's some sort of inventory of road conditions, have some sort of asset management plan where we know the inventory and we'll have that data. A second piece here, the second box, starting on the left side going down, you'll have that information, process the data in some way, and use it to rate the streets. And then the third box is there's going to be a resurfacing list. And it could be, this is something that maybe you revise once a year or every couple of years, but at some point there's going to be a list, and there's going to be a number 1, number 2, et cetera, through the list. There may or may not be, you can see the sub box there, some agency review, and then it might get adjusted, and then obviously there's a final list. So you go over to the right side, you prepare to implement, and you may or may not prepare roadway markings and pavement markings, or you might just put it back the way it was before. And then typically, and you'll see the dark blue box here with the white lettering, this is where there's an opportunity to add bike facilities. And of course, you can see right away the challenge with this model. You go through this whole process, and then at the last moment, there's like, are we going to put in some bike facilities? And of course, having been a project manager, and I'm guessing that a lot of you on the phone are, you know that when you get your job review, it's did you get your project on time and within budget? And when something like this shows up at the last moment, no matter how friendly you are to bicycling and eager you are to help out, to have something come in like this at the last moment is likely going to delay your project and cost you some money. And it may be a real reason that a lot of bike facilities simply don't get installed as part of resurfacing projects. So just keep that in mind, and then we're going to go forward here. So the limitations of the typical process, that chart I just showed you, it's quite often the resurfacing is tied to the rating. It may be done in a separate silo from other roadway projects, so maybe there's no communication. And it may be part of a CIP, it may not. The ones that are not are usually the tougher ones because they're really fast-paced, going to the last bullet there. And when they're really fast-paced, and then if you show up at the last moment, it could slow things down. And again, something that just quite often doesn't work for agencies. So the recommendations of the workbook, and I'll have a slide on each one. We're going to talk about extended timeline, the use of multimodal approach, including bike staff, reviewing the bike plan, and be flexible with design. I'll have a slide on each one of these. So probably the most important recommendation of the workbook is an extended timeline for the annual resurfacing projects. And what we're recommending is a 2-year cycle instead of a 1-year cycle. Now, obviously, if you move from a 1-year cycle to a 2-year cycle, the transition year, you're probably not going to put as much pavement down that first year. But once you're into the 2-year cycle, then obviously you do as much as before. And what this allows for is to involve the public. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And also, it allows for doing a new channelization plan. Obviously, that's required if you're going to put in some bike facilities with the resurfacing. So 1 year to 2 year, probably one of the main recommendations. We're also recommending a multimodal approach. And what we mean by this is that even though the focus may be bike facilities, you really want to make a lot of other improvements at the same time. And the more that you can make it multimodal, the more inclusive it is, the more you're going to generate public support, and that it, especially if you make walking improvements, because everyone walks, not everyone bikes. So this picture here is a project I worked on, and by the way, if I give you Seattle examples, it's not because Seattle does it better than anybody else. It just happens to be where I live, so those are some of my stories. But this is an example of a street with a road diet. It was a 4-lane road, and they went to 2 lanes, put in buffered bike lanes, as you can see. And then as part of the project, they put in this crossing island. And there happened to be senior housing in this area. And by doing this, it generated a lot of support among the neighbors there who needed to get across the street. So just, you know, one example of the multimodal approach and generating a broader base of support, including bike staff. I think, again, this gets back to the silos. And if you do have bicycle staff for, you know, early on, for every single project that you're involved in, you want to have a meeting with the bicycle staff. Obviously, you want to bring in pedestrian staff as well. Could be the same person or someone else. But they're going to be familiar with the bike plans, the connections, both current and the future. And I've worked with a lot of teams, and I've always found that early on meetings, before things are fully scoped, and bringing in all the different disciplines, you just always get a better outcome for everyone involved. And by starting again early, you make sure that you don't have this last minute show up, and then you've got issues with time and budget. This is also an endorsement for having a bike plan, because what you don't want to do is for every resurfacing project have to figure out, is this an important bike street? And so if you have a plan, and if it includes, you know, good maps that show, you know, proposed cross sections, you know, this is where we want a buffered bike lane, for example, and you already have that in place, it makes it much easier to go to the plan and say, okay, we've already figured this out. This is a really important street, or nope, this one's not as important, and have some direction as to where you want to go. Now, usually you're going to have to review this again and still do some public involvement, but it certainly, it certainly really helps a lot and moves the process along. So this is one of my favorite books that FHWA just put out, called Achieving Multimodal Networks, and it really you know, focuses on safety. What I really like about this particular book is it really goes through and identifies all the institutional barriers that could exist to putting in bike facilities. So things like road diets and things like lane diets and all the things that Jeremy is going to talk about in a little bit. There's a lot of myths out there, what you may do and what you know, it's that it gets back to those you must, you may, you should, you could, all those keywords. And what this workbook does is it goes through existing guidance, so things that FHWA has put out, things that MUTCD has put out, different AASHTO guides, and interim guidance, and it uses that to say you have permission from the national guidance to do this, 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 and this. So the topics in here were specifically chosen to address barriers that we always run up against in terms of doing some of this. And I think the word that I like with this manual is the word permission. It gives permission to do a lot of things. So just recapping some of the common pitfalls, again, of the one-year cycle. We talked about the short timeline, inadequate public participation, design constraints. There might not be enough space, lack of logical project extents. In other words, where do you start and end the project, and the loss of existing facilities. And I'll quickly go through each one of these. So again, we talked about the time frame, and on the right here is just another version of what I showed you before, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing again. But again, you get the idea, is that the quick time frame, the isolation, the silos, the quick turnaround, all those things are reasons why quite often we are unable to get bike facilities in on repaving, haven't figured out a way to institutionalize it. So again, in terms of addressing the short time frame, the key is just planning ahead, going from 1 year to 2 years, and then making sure that we have a bike plan in place and that we use it so we know exactly what's going to happen. So I think the word plan ahead here really captures that well. So this is how we're suggesting the short time frame be addressed. This is the same chart I went through a few slides back, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing again, but you can see the change. The first flow diagram that I showed you showed sort of the bike idea coming in quite at the very end. And what this is suggesting is that once you produce the preliminary resurfacing list, before you go any further, you start looking at the list and comparing it to the bike plan and the bike needs, and then identifying very early on what streets where there's an opportunity to incorporate bike facilities. I'm actually going to push this a little further and suggest that some communities now, in terms of producing the list in the first place, so even going a little earlier in the process, is when they're doing the prioritization. And quite often when you're doing prioritization, this criteria is making one of the criteria is this an important roadway or street in the bike plan? And so the bike plan itself starts to influence the list. Now, you don't want to overdo that. You certainly want to resurface those streets that really need resurfacing, but it's also a good idea, and a lot of communities have done this already, where when you're doing the scoring, when you're doing the prioritization, you have your formula, you allow the need for bike facilities to influence the list itself. But certainly when you have the list, as soon as you have the list, early on, 2 years before you actually do the resurfacing, you need to start thinking about what bike facilities you want to incorporate into the resurfacing. Lack of logical project extents, and that's a fancy way of saying, sometimes it's hard to figure out a beginning and an end. And one of the things that we don't want to do is to have you put people on a really nice bike facility, and all of a sudden you get to a spot where, help, it ends, and all of a sudden you have fairly inexperienced cyclists finding themselves in a situation where they're really uncomfortable because the road conditions change, the bike facility disappears. And so the key is to work ahead on this. And I've worked with a lot of these over years when I was working with the city of Seattle. And sometimes there's not a problem. Quite often there's a nearby bike facility that you can provide signing to. So if the resurfacing project goes, say, 1 mile, maybe just a block or two short of that 1 mile, you can provide some signing that directs you to another facility. That can maybe even use in a residential street connector or something like that. Maybe it's even temporary or interim. The other thing that I did quite often is you can maybe either shorten the resurfacing project a bit or lengthen it a bit or coordinate it so that, the second year there's a second piece done. A lot of different ways to be creative about it, but what we're not recommending is that you simply don't do anything. And so, again, a lot of times I think the signing and just planning ahead, and that's why planning 2 years ahead is so important too, because you don't want to leave people just sort of stranded, but at the same time you don't want to lose that opportunity. Now, absolute worst case, I've done this, is you restripe the street so there's space for the bike lane, and then maybe you add it a year later when the full project is put in, if there's like a 2-part project or something like that. And that can be done. Usually that, I would call that Plan B, but certainly that can be done. So some design constraints. Obviously, when you're doing curb to curb, there's going to be challenges with the amount of space available. And this is really why I think it's so important to use the workbook that I just referenced a little while ago. in looking at what you can do and what's recommended and maybe where you should be careful. And Jeremy will talk about this in just a couple minutes, about at the end here. He'll talk about that a lot more in terms of what permissions do you have to, for example, reduce the width of lanes, that kind of thing. And what are the opportunities to work within this constraint of what you have. So we'll be in the next section. We'll be talking about lane diets, road diets, parking removal, adding shoulders, all the things that you can do to address design constraints. And again, the good design guidance out there. We're so fortunate to have such good guidance now. You have the FHWA guidance, local design guidance. I think the biggest issues, though, quite often, because we have the really good design guidance, is just institutionalization within your own programs and figuring out the process part and where you can influence that process. Public participation. Obviously, if you're going to do a road diet and change the number of lanes, and you're going to have to do more public process. And again, if you go from 1 year to 2 years, you're going to have the time that you need to talk about the complexity of the project and to get the public involved. Just another slide here in public participation. And again, extending that time frame allows for this. And every community does the public involvement slightly differently. And I think that the key here on the road diet in particular is, people are going to be concerned about congestion. I'm not going to talk about right here. Jeremy will talk a little bit more about that, but you really have to be prepared here to answer the questions, have good answers, and really, we have enough history on this now to have very, very good answers and just be really thorough when you do the public outreach. And then finally, one issue could be the loss of bikeways. And this just means that there could be an existing bikeway and the street's repaved and the bikeway isn't put back. And where I've seen it happen is that there's a channelization plan, and then the bike facility, or like the bike lanes, are added as a separate project, but the CHAN plan, or the channelization plan, is never updated to include that bike facility. So a contractor gets, the channelization plan, repaves the street, puts it back exactly like what's on the channelization plan, not exactly what was out there. So one of the things that I've always done is on all these projects is check the channelization plan that goes to the contractor, make sure that it's the right one, and then once the resurfacing is done, go out in the street, check the little tick marks and make sure that where the lines are going are in the right place. And it's amazing how often things just don't happen quite the way they're supposed to. So just something to be aware of. So to recap, here's the typical process. And you can see coming in late, just not a friendly welcome from the project manager, at least I wouldn't be from time and money perspective. And what we're suggesting is to go to a 2-year process and get involved much early on, right in the beginning of the process, figure out what bike facilities you want to put in as part of resurfacing, and then again go from a 1-year timeline to a timeline. And that's it for my part.
Great, thanks so much, Pete. I appreciate that. It's a great overview of the whole process, and I think we'll be coming back to some of the things you mentioned. We're going to shift things over to Jeremy to really get into some of the design pieces and elements and what we can do during the resurfacing process itself. So Jeremy, I see your screen and that's ready.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Dan and Pete. So yeah, I'm going to go over some basic concepts of road diets and other things that we can do once we get this incorporated in our process to incorporate bike lanes. So what I'll talk about is some of that flexibility and design that Pete alluded to, road diets as a whole, some other methods, and then I'll briefly touch on the costs and the cost benefits associated with pursuing this process over the traditional process that we're oftentimes following. And Pete spoke briefly about this FHWA Achieving Multimodal Networks guide. This is a really incredible document that summarizes what the national guidelines actually say, as opposed to what we've always been taught that they said. So in order to develop this guide, we went through the AASHTO guide and other FHWA documents and really reread them to boil down this sort of ability that you have to implement narrower lanes and other types of lane configuration. So in the workshops that we've been doing around the country, we always conclude with actionable items and real things that people can do when they leave that workshop. And more often than not, somebody raises their hand and says, I didn't know anything about that Achieving Multimodal Networks guide. I'm definitely going to read through that. So if you're not familiar with that, I highly encourage you to download the copy for free and read through it. The real highlights of it for me with regards to resurfacing are this ability to use different lane widths, the ability and options you have with regards to traffic calming and adjusting your speeds, some basic guidance on road diets and paved shoulders, and also some information on separated bike lanes, because we're always getting questions about design guidance with regards to separated bike lanes and what document says that I'm allowed to do them. So this kind of helps to boil some of that down for you. Another area that's been identified as a place where you have flexibility is this memo from May 2016 from FHWA, changing the controlling criteria for lower speed roadway design. So while that used to be 13 controlling criteria with regards to lane widths and shoulder widths, curb radius, all these different things, the FHWA memo changes that controlling criteria from 13 to 10 for those higher speed roadways, but where we're actually implementing bike facilities, these lower speed roads, those controlling criteria were reduced to 2. One relating to structural capacity of bridges and the other one relating to design speed. So the federal government has weighed in and said you don't need design exceptions for narrower lanes. What really becomes the problem now is that a lot of our state requirements have codified some of these larger lane widths and rolled them into their design practices. So it's important to make our state and local officials aware that the federal government has said that those aren't necessarily the appropriate widths for all conditions, and we need to take a closer look at how we're implementing lane widths. And as you see here, as we look through the other design guidance, the AASHTO Green Book, which is sort of the Bible for highway design, even it points to the fact that lane widths can be between 9 to 12 feet in width, and research has shown us that 10 and 11 foot lanes don't create a negative safety effect and actually show significant benefit with regards to crash reduction. So being able to point to what the guiding documents actually say and using that to influence your decisions about different lane widths and different configurations that you can implement on your roadways. One of the other myths is this sort of cyclical adjustment of posted speed based on your design speed, and a lot of the older design documents talk about selecting design speeds 5 or 10 miles higher than your posted speed, which inevitably just encourages people to drive faster, and it just becomes this problematic cyclical approach. So the guidance documents now basically give you the ability to set your design speed and your posted speed as the same, but also understanding that you have the ability to get speeds down below your posted speeds through different treatments. And one of my favorite examples of this is things that I see in like Portland, Oregon or Philadelphia, where they will adjust their signal timings to provide 20-mile-an-hour green waves to encourage people to drive at a lower speed. I think we need to look at sort of those unique approaches to regulating speed, regardless of what the posted speed is, to encourage people to travel through a neighborhood at the speed that we actually want them to go. So in the workbook, we talk about different methods for including the bikeways, being road diets, lane diets, parking removal, and how we can better utilize existing shoulders that are already present along a roadway. So diving into the first one, road diets, this is where we're going to reconfigure the number of travel lanes to carve out the space that we need for bicycle lanes. So the example that's shown on the screen here is your typical 4-lane roadway, parking on each side. More often than not, we find that these are very generous width for the roadways. And so if we reconfigure that from 4 lanes to 3 travel lanes, just the act of purging that 1 lane will give us enough space to create a bike lane on each side of the street. And what we generally find with these types of roadways, the 4 to 3 conversion, is that if your average daily traffic is at or below 20,000 vehicles, it's probably a perfect candidate for this type of implementation. If you look at a variety of other guidance documents, some of them, local guidance documents, will say as high as 25,000 ADT, and some of them say as low as 18,000 ADT, but regardless, if you're in this approximate range of traffic, your road is probably a good candidate for a 4 to 3 conversion. And here's just a great example that we saw when we were giving this training in Binghamton, New York, where it's a commercial corridor, a lot of driveways and things like that where people are trying to turn into adjacent roadways and gain access to and from the highway. And the ability to convert that from 4 to 3 didn't really change the number of vehicles that were using the road, but provided more space for them to add the bike lanes on each side of the road. So sort of the highlights of the 4 to 3, that's sort of our most popular implementation of road diets, but converting from 4 to 2 is another option. I'll get into that in a few moments. The ability to add that center turn lane is really the overarching benefit of that 4 to 3 conversion, because I'm sure you've all experienced it where you're driving down a 4-lane roadway and somebody stops in the leftmost lane to turn to access the side streets or their driveway or whatever. And generally speaking, these 4-lane roadways with access points along them function more like 2 travel lanes, and you get people sort of weaving back and forward to try and avoid those stopped vehicles that are making the turns. You also have the ability to add medians, particularly in what's often referred to as that suicide lane, the center turn lane. And by adding the median in that space at regular intervals could help to reduce the frequency of somebody trying to pass someone. So avoiding that other concern that we will sometimes hear with regards to road diet. So again, the general range, 20,000, is sort of our trigger point. You can adjust your travel lanes in addition to removing lanes to carve out even more space. Might create the ability for you to do a buffered bike lane as opposed to a traditional bike lane. But generally, selecting lane widths that will work for your particular corridor and your road users and vehicle types. The center lane width will often vary from 10 to 16 feet. I like to often err on the narrower side, but there are instances based on speed and vehicle type where that wider width it may be appropriate for your roadway characteristics. And as you can see on the graphic here on the right, that sort of illustrates the benefits that we can gain from using a 4 to 3 conversion, because we're going to reduce the number of conflicts that exist and oftentimes the crash severity of these is also reduced. In addition to all of that, pedestrian benefits are pretty significant as well, because now the pedestrian isn't crossing two moving travel lanes, it's more like one. So we'll often be able to avoid the multiple threat that we see for mid-block crossings and things of that nature. And when we look at what the effects of the road diet have on the overarching ADTs and speed, we see that ADT really doesn't change. Here's 5 examples from Seattle. The top 4 really doesn't fluctuate much, single digits. And the bottom one actually had a 20% increase in ADT when the road diet was implemented. My guess is because traffic actually flowed more consistently along it, and therefore people were like, oh, this is a much more comfortable road to ride on now. But in addition to all of that, you're seeing the collision rates going down, the speeds going down, and those top-end speeders, the faster folks, their speeds are also going down, because by and large, they're being regulated by one driver that's going at the speed limit that's in front of them. So it's sort of a self-regulating design, when coupled with narrower lane widths, really encourages people to drive at the speed that we want them to drive at. And we're also not seeing a real degradation in travel time. 3 of the 5 had no change, while the other ones had very minor increases in travel time. So the challenge always is public involvement and engagement. One of my mentors always said that people love change as long as it's exactly the same when you put it back, and I think that holds true also for road diets. People like that there are a certain number of lanes out there, and have the perception that it might not function as well as it does today. So it's good to be able to go into meetings with the public, go into meetings with businesses and property owners, and have real statistics that you can show them, real projects that have been implemented to show the safety benefits, being able to point business owners to the economic studies associated with implementing road diets and adding bike lanes, and showing them that while they may think everybody drives to their business, in reality, lots of people will walk and bike and use transit, and making them aware that the data that we look at shows that their business can actually be improved by changing what we're seeing on the roadway. And there's a link down there to the Road Diets FHWA guide, which you can look to for some other examples of resources such as these economic and policy impacts that can really guide some of those discussions that you have with your stakeholders. The last thing I'll point out on this one is making sure that you're doing the appropriate level of traffic study and being aware that signal upgrades are often necessary when you're implementing a road diet, because you're shifting lanes, and in some instances your mast arms may already be of the appropriate length, and you're able to shift the signal heads to the appropriate location, but oftentimes there are some signal upgrades that need to occur, and so you should be planning that as part of your cost estimation and planning process. And I mentioned it before that sometimes we're able to do a 4-to-2 conversion, going down to only 2 travel lanes. This works well when you don't have a lot of left-turning vehicles and your ADTs are still very low. But when you're able to find those roadways that can accommodate these types of upgrades, it gives you a lot more space to implement protected bike lanes. Here in the photo, you're seeing a floating bus island and being able to create a separated bike lane behind that. So just looking for those opportunities to where you can carve out more space to create a lower stress bicycle network. So similar to the last example, you have a 4-lane roadway, parking on each side, and being able to carve out a little bit more space to create that separated bike lane, 2 travel lanes, all while still maintaining parking along your roadway. I'd mentioned this before. Reference back to the FHWA road diet guidelines. It will provide you a lot of information with regards to ADTs and widths and what's applicable when. So that's one of those guides that I like to go back to anytime there's a question related to road diets. And in addition to the federal guidelines, there are a bunch of states that have implemented their own road diet guidelines and have additional information. So I would encourage you, even if these aren't your states, to at least flip through them and sort of become familiar with what some other states are doing. May help to influence some of the decisions you're making on your roadways. And then lane diets, where we're going to keep the same number of travel lanes, but narrow up the widths of those to carve out enough space to accommodate bike lanes. So if you imagine that this is 4 travel lanes, each 12 foot wide, and you have 8 foot parking on both sides, if you're able to narrow those lanes down to 10 feet and narrow your parking from 8 to 7, that's going to give you enough space to do 5 foot bike lanes on each side of the road. You're not always going to have those particular widths, and sometimes you may only find that you can narrow up those lanes enough to create a bike facility on one side of the road while still maintaining the vehicular capacity and the parking. And I encourage you in those situations to consider adding that single bike lane if it makes sense in completing your bicycle network, and then looking for other opportunities on parallel streets to be able to provide sort of that sister bike lane that would accommodate a lower stress environment in the opposite direction. And if you can combine the concepts of a road diet and a lane diet, reducing from 4 lanes to 3 and narrowing up those lanes, that's when you're really able to find space to create a lower stress bicycle network. So while here we're showing buffered bike lanes with parking behind it, I think in the same scenario you might be able to find the space to do a parking protected separated bike lane. So looking at the space you have, what you can modify it to, and making it work for your particular community. I think this is a great example from Philadelphia. Ryan Avenue previously had bike lanes and a travel lane in each direction, as well as parking on both sides. And as part of their resurfacing, they were able to narrow up those lanes a little bit, get rid of the median in the middle, still maintain parking on both sides, but be able to create a 2-way separated bike lane. So I encourage you, even on those roadways where you currently have bike lanes, looking to see, are there changes that could be made to make that a higher quality, lower stress bicycle environment. So the benefits of the lane diet, one, it's great traffic calming. Anytime you're narrowing up the lanes, it becomes a little harder, a little less comfortable for somebody to try and drive at a faster speed. Seeing the safety benefits associated with people driving at the speeds that you wanted them to drive at or had designed for them to drive at. And we find that narrowing up the lanes actually is associated with a lower crash frequency. So not only is there this speed benefit of vehicles traveling at lower speeds, but we're seeing that the frequency of crashes are also going down with the implementation of a lane diet. So the considerations, it's important to show local officials that policy has changed at the federal level. So while they may have an idea that lanes need to be 12 or 14 feet in width, making them aware that the guidelines actually give you the flexibility to select lane widths that are appropriate for your environment. And also being able to point back to the AASHTO guide, which talks about that 10-foot lanes are appropriate, with 11 feet lanes being appropriate if you have high truck traffic, buses, or larger vehicles that are using it with, I would say, a significant level of frequency. Sort of touching on some of those same points, making sure you're influencing the decisions that your state and local officials are making, particularly when they're updating their design policies. Oftentimes they're reverting back to what the federal government had said and using that to guide their decisions, and so making them aware that the guidelines themselves have changed. And making sure that you know the standards when you're speaking with the public. Know what the standards are, and also know what the benefits, economic, safety, what those benefits are with regards to lane diets and road diets, and being able to speak to those benefits when engaging with those officials. Probably the most contentious of the various options is the, or at least controversial methods, is the removal of parking. So you might not want to remove parking as your first project to try and implement bicycle facilities. We don't want to be creating any backlash with regards to implementing bicycle facilities, but certainly there are ample opportunities to remove parking to create a more multimodal network without negatively affecting the ability for those who drive to find parking. So looking for opportunities where parking is underutilized or lightly utilized, and doing sort of an assessment of what the available parking is in your particular project area or jurisdiction. Oftentimes you can get some of this information from your parking authorities or from other studies that have been done, but being aware of how much actual parking is available when trying to have the conversation about eliminating parking to accommodate bike lanes. So in this example, we have a travel lane in each direction, 2 parking lanes, and by eliminating 1 parking lane, narrowing up those lane widths a little bit, able to carve out enough space for a bike lane in both directions. So the challenges, and I think we all know that the public engagement piece of removing parking is the most challenging aspect of it, but realizing that there's often available parking on those adjacent side streets or in off-street lots to be able to accommodate the needs of all the different users. So make sure you have that information on hand when speaking with your business and property owners along the project. And the last method is paving shoulders. Oftentimes, or at least in some instances, you have existing gravel shoulders out there that might have a sufficient subbase to accommodate the loading of vehicles. And so simply by adding the asphalt atop that gravel base, you might be able to widen the functional width of your edge-to-edge roadway. Done in conjunction with some lane diets, you might be able to create enough space that will function well for accommodating bicyclists in a more rural environment where we would rather have them, rather be able to provide them enough space to function within the shoulder area. So some other benefits, in addition to finding a space to accommodate bicyclists, when you pave your shoulders, it will often increase the life of your pavement. You don't end up with that edge crumbling that you will often see on a narrower paved roadway. So reducing the frequency at which you need to go out there and do additional maintenance. And I just experienced this yesterday driving through Delaware. The ability to accommodate agricultural equipment, maintenance vehicles, if you live in an area with Amish, people in horse-drawn buggies. And so I saw that being used significantly, specifically for those users, as well as a few bicyclists. So also understanding that this can have a benefit for all the different users of your roadway. The last thing I'll touch on is some basic information on cost and materials. We find that there is considerable cost savings when incorporating bike lanes into your resurfacing program, as opposed to trying to go back later and retrofit it in with eradication and new markings, to the point where it could cost as little as 1/3 of the overall cost of what you would have spent if instead you roll it into your resurfacing project. And really, it's one of those instances where we're trying to be the best stewards of the taxpayer dollar. So I know as a taxpayer and taking my engineering hat off, when I see a roadway repaved and striped, and then a year later I see them out there grinding out markings and putting something else down, I think that is a really challenging thing for the public to understand, that there was this process to try and incorporate the bike lanes, and it didn't work in the repaving program. By changing the way we approach the repaving program to incorporate these facilities into it, the public is going to see that as a better use of their taxpayer dollars. Understanding when selecting the material types that you're picking the appropriate materials for the durability, retroreflectivity. Are there concerns about slippery surfaces? Every agency has sort of defined policies on which markings to use on asphalt versus concrete. And I would just encourage you to revert back to those, as well as assess whether they're appropriate for your specific use. One example with regard to durability is if all of your markings are typically thermoplastic, but now you're going to create an environment where no vehicular loads are going over certain lane lines, does it necessarily make sense to put back a really high quality, durable material that isn't going to experience a lot of vehicular loading? So selecting the material that's appropriate for your specific use. And I would point you to the NCHRP report 306, where they really boil down the pros and cons of each of the different paving materials, as well as the costs associated with them, with thermoplastic being the most durable, but also the most expensive, and traditional paint being sort of the lower cost option, but you're going to have to go out and repaint it with a more frequent occurrence. So I'd point you to that resource to get a little more information, do the cost-benefit analysis for your specific locations, and make your selection accordingly. And with that, I think we'll move it to questions. I do encourage you to download the workbook from the FHWA webpage. For your convenience, I created a tiny URL for you, so you don't have to write down that long one. You can do tinyurl.com FHWA bike lanes.
Thanks very much, Jeremy, for doing that. And I actually, as you all were talking, I was kind of dropping some links here and there into the chat pod. So if you want to find your link bank of resources, scroll back up through that, and you can find some things there. Everything from the road diet guide to NCHRP report 306 and a few other things. So thanks for doing all that. I'm going to take the screen back to get us into our Q&A period here. Give me just a moment. I'll go full screen. If you haven't already, please submit your questions into the chat pod. It's over there on the right. We're interested in hearing from you about what you're wondering about and what you're struggling with in particular. So I thought that what I'd like to do is come through and just spend some time responding to each of the questions we've referred so far, or we've received so far, and then as more come in, we'll get to those. But Becky, I wanted to start with you actually, because we've heard a lot in this webinar here about the guidance on the resurfacing process, but a lot of the recommendations stretch all the way back to some of the work from a couple of years ago, the road diets guide, and a lot of other things that have been done. So I guess, can you speak generally about what you're seeing from your work on that road diet guide all the way to now? Is this process, is this becoming more and more commonplace from your perspective as you've worked on these things for FHWA?
Yeah, Dan, thanks for that question. Absolutely. For the past 2 years, we have been promoting road diets through our Everyday Counts initiative. So we have gotten out to a number of states and done technical assistance. We've done workshops on the informational guide. And those workshops are still available free of charge. So if there's anyone on the webinar that's interested in a workshop on road diets, please reach out to me. We're trying to combine locations. So if it's a city or a locality, if we can get a couple localities interested, we'd like to have 40 people attend the workshop. So just know that that is still ongoing. We actually had, I hope I'm getting my numbers right, but I think we had 24 states that actually institutionalized road diets through our 2-year period that ended in December 2016. So we are seeing a lot of states using road diets to accomplish exactly what we talked about today, incorporating bikeways, reconfiguring the roadway to accommodate all users. So Dan, absolutely, we're seeing a big push for road diets right now.
And that's my perspective as well. And I'm sure Pete and Jeremy can share. Having been on the ground and doing these workshops, I'm sure they're seeing the quick uptake from agencies all over the place. But I think there's got to be some maybe holdout on this process. And I don't want to make this all about road diets necessarily, but lane width in particular is something, Jeremy, you talked about. And I think you hear the argument all the time why we need to go to narrower lanes. There's so many benefits, yet there's still not widespread acceptance of something narrower than 12 feet. Can you talk maybe a bit, and maybe Pete too, just about some of the arguments back against a narrower lane? Why are we still not seeing more widespread use of a sub 12-foot lane?
Yeah, I mean, I hear lots of excuses, the widths of bus mirrors and the widths of trucks and not being able to accommodate their widths. But the research doesn't pan out when those arguments are put up against locations where those exact widths are used and those exact vehicle types are used, and it still works with the narrower widths. A lot of the issue comes from the fact that many states have minimum lane width guidelines. So even though AASHTO and FHWA give you this ability to add flexibility and really look at the context of your roadway and select the width that's appropriate, a lot of agencies and engineers revert back to those minimums or even higher based on their agency's policies, which aren't based on the safety benefits associated with the narrower width. So really the wider widths just encourage vehicles to go faster. The narrower widths are still able to accommodate those users and helps to reduce those speeds.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. I think it's you've laid it out very well, and I'd encourage people who maybe have some skeptics, lane width skeptics on their in their departments or maybe in partner organizations. I encourage you to share that information with them. I think that we've been able to demonstrate that time and time again. I wanted to touch on getting back to Pete, because Pete, I know you've done webinars for us in the past on all about public involvement and getting using stakeholder input and the importance of that. And I think one of the selling points on the resurfacing, incorporating things into the resurfacing project, is that you're kind of using that to implement things that have already been kind of accepted and put out in the bike plan or some other plan, and that those plans use the public input process to get to that point. Yet I think something like a road diet can be somewhat sudden for someone to go out and drive on a road, and all of a sudden lanes are missing. So can you talk about the need to maybe do additional public input processes? I know both of you mentioned this, but I wanted to get back to it. Additional public input, even on top of something that might already be in a plan, if you're doing something like a road diet in particular.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The first process is doing it in the plan, but you're going to end up doing additional process when you actually put in a road diet. And I always think that the best thing you can do when you're doing a road diet, if you're doing the first one, is to pick a sort of a slam dunker. If you pick a road diet and there's a perception it didn't work, then you'll never get to do another one. So I think the best public involvement is to pick one that you just know is going to work really well. Pick an easy one, the first one in your community. And then once you have one, you have a model then that people can go visit and it gives you permission to do another one and another one, and then you can do ones that are a little bit more challenging. And I would just reiterate, too, what Jeremy said, is that the key to a successful road diet is to redo the signals at the same time. Because if you don't, then where people experience congestion and where they wait is at signals, and the public will not interpret it as, oh, there's something wrong with the signal. They'll interpret it as the road diet failed, and once you have a failure, it doesn't go again. So yes, you need to do the public involvement. I would start with an easier one, and then when you have a model of one, people can go look at it. And I guess the other part of public involvement, I always look at it as sort of the three-legged stool of public involvement. I think, obviously there's going to be geographically based people. Those are the people who live along or have businesses in the area where you're doing a project. And then you're going to hopefully have a local bike advisory board that can become involved. And then you're going to have your local advocacy group. And, all three are important. And at the local level, too, that's where you get not only the neighborhood group involved, but a business group involved as well. And what that does is it ensures a real diverse group of people involved. And, you don't want just one group to be able to sort of call the shot on it, if you will. You really want the negotiation to happen within the context of community. And that's a whole separate workshop, but I think there's some really good ways of approaching that I'll not go into at this point, but hopefully that answers part of your question.
And Dan, the last thing I would mention on that is particularly when it's your first one and you kind of have a lukewarm response, not sure whether you want to do it. I mean, you're going to be out there in a year repaving and putting something back. One of my favorite tools is to do the quote-unquote pilot program where you just implement it and call it a temporary project, and when it works, then when it gets repaved, you put it back in the permanent installation. But it's a great truth check-in and a great way to demonstrate to those that have concerns that ultimately those concerns are sort of unfounded, and that the road will still function the way it was intended and can accommodate more people.
Yeah, I like that. I like that idea, definitely. And I wonder, we got some questions about if you can point to, or maybe even just describe situations where maybe a road diet or a lane narrowing or some project was done and maybe it wasn't so successful, and they were successful in turning it back. I guess that I can see opportunity to do that, but I can also see some folks being upset about the maybe reversion back to the existing condition. Can you point to a place where that happened, or maybe just an example of that happening?
I'm aware of
any?
Yeah, I'm aware of maybe 3 that haven't worked, and I'm probably not going to mention them, but all 3 cases, same problem. They didn't deal with the signals. Yeah. And I can think of another one. I won't mention exactly where, but it was a community with a lot of tourist, seasonal tourist traffic, and the road diet was done based on sort of the off-peak period. So the peak period was there was some problems there, and it was ended up turning back. So I just say that's just more of a lesson learned about, take into account, Jeremy, you mentioned that sort of 20,000 ADT roughly as your maybe a target or a limit. I'd say, you want to look at peak periods and off-peak and all that. Take all the data you can get before going forward with something like that, obviously. But I think that if you prepare well, hopefully you won't be in that sort of scenario. Let me add just one thought, a little bit out of the box here. There's 2 ways to sort of approach this. One is more of a reactive approach, which says, we need to maintain a certain level of motor vehicle traffic, and that's fine. I do that all the time. But there's also another way to kind of flip the thinking on this and take more of a proactive approach and say, how do we want this street to work? What's the appropriate number of motor vehicles? How many pedestrians? How many bicyclists? And let's create a street that then operates the way we want it to. Sort of what Jeremy said about the speed, as opposed to just being in reactive mode. So that's one thought. The other, and this gets into an equity issue that I think is really important, is what are our performance measures? How do we measure success? And one way to do it is just to count motor vehicles, sort of before and after. That means that you have to have a certain affluence and income to be able to drive a car alone. And the question I always challenge communities with is, does a bus with 30 people in it count as 1 or 30? In other words, are we counting people or are we counting machinery? And it's just something to think about. And quite often, if you set the performance measures differently on a road diet, it's even more successful. So you count the pedestrians, you count the bicyclists, you count the motor vehicles, you count the buses, and the number, and not just the buses, but the number of people on them, and the people in carpools and van pools. And so when you start counting people, you get incredible value on a lot of the road diets. So, and you can see, obviously, if you don't count people on buses, that can start to be exclusionary, leave people out, and you can start to see some of the equity issues involved in this as well. So just a lot of different things to think about when you're putting together your performance measures.
Yeah, the last thing I'd say on that is every time I went to do one of these trainings around the country, the first thing I did was to look up what the car ownership rate was in the neighboring cities and communities. And a lot of times that was 1 in 3, 1 in 4 people, 1 in 5 people don't have access to a vehicle, or their household doesn't have access to a vehicle. And if we're going to be able to accommodate all users, it's important to have that fact in the back of your mind when designing different types of roadways.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I wanted to kind of get us back maybe a little bit more on this whole process, Pete, that you sort of laid out this process for how we can build into resurfacing efforts and maybe plan ahead. And so I think one of the challenges that it seems like some attendees are having, and I've heard this in some places too, is the real challenge is not necessarily getting involved in this process, but it's actually getting that schedule and maybe of resurfacing in advance, and far enough in advance to make a plan. And the cases that I'm hearing about have to do with areas where a state DOT might be doing the resurfacing. The local road has the recommendations for that are laid out in the bike plan, but the local municipality may have issues or difficulty getting the schedule from the state. And I wonder if you have recommendations or have seen good ways of maybe getting that conversation started between the local municipality and the state to say, please share this information. Here's the benefit to doing it. Do you have recommendations as maybe a first step in an agency that might be struggling?
Sure. And that's a really good question, and it doesn't lend itself to a really easy answer. That can be a tough one. But I guess a couple of things. One is that I think to just kind of write down, take the sketch that I went over with the different boxes and sketch out what is the current process as understood. And if you're at a local agency, sketch out your understanding of how it works and where the gaps are, or what's not working, and get that flow going, and make sure that there's an agreement on how it's working. And then secondly, it's part of a bigger relationship issue between local governments and states. And so, the whole process of how they work together, how they, like small towns, how small communities with a state route through them, how they work with the state, it becomes part of a larger interagency agreement. And so I've always just encouraged people to get it on paper, get it over to the state. You're going to have to get higher-ups supporting this conversation. So you may need to get your city manager or mayor or whoever involved so that it's elevated enough to say, okay, we can work together, but we just need to meet and not have things happen without any communication or back and forth. So I always like to hang my hat on words like predictability, transparency, local context, those kinds of things. And then, Becky, maybe you can comment on this too. There's a new FHWA guidance that's come out, I think, within the last 6 months or so on this very topic in terms of state roads through small towns.
Yeah, we saw a lot of great conversations in the workshops because we had officials from the DOTs, from the cities, from the local municipalities, and really used that workshop as the opportunity to start that conversation. So I would encourage you, if you weren't in those workshops, to request that meeting between those agencies and begin to have that conversation.
Did you have something to share on that?
Well, I was just going to say, I think there's more information on that guide that Pete was talking about through the Office of Safety. So folks could do a Google search to see if they could find it, because I know that's not out of the Office of Safety.
Which one is that again?
The for small towns.
Oh yeah, and I shared it earlier in the chat pod.
You did? Okay, good.
Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks Guide. Yeah, that's a great resource for those in smaller towns and more rural settings, rural villages. That's a really good resource. There are a few more questions that came up, and one issue that came up I thought was really interesting. It gets away from bicycle facilities and actually gets to the same topic, resurfacing, but with respect to pedestrian facilities. And there were some examples that were shared with us of agencies that have actually had resurfacing done, and elements of the pedestrian environment when the roads were resurfaced were left out. And these are things like crosswalks that had been marked that were not remarked during the after period. And in fact, a few cases where curb ramp work had not been done as part of that resurfacing. And I know it gets a bit beyond the bicycle side of things, but can you all speak a bit about the importance of not only getting projects into the resurfacing, but ensuring that the resurfacing process is hitting all the key points and making sure everything gets put back in the right place afterward? Is there anything in advanced planning an agency can do to make sure that happens?
I'll start with two quick things. This is very similar to the problem of bike facilities that don't get put back in. So it always starts with making sure the channelization plans are up to date, and you know, if the contractor's been asked to do this chan plan and it doesn't include the PED facilities that are on the ground, it may not happen. So it starts there, and then secondly, again, it always goes back to checking before the paints are, you know, the paint lines are memorialized, checking to make sure the little dot lines out there are done correctly, certainly doing that. The other part of it is, though, is I have found that sometimes everything is done correctly. You know, you have the right plans, you have the right contract, everything's done correctly, and then you go out after the project's done, and whoops, you know, it didn't get done correctly. And quite often, I have found that the glitches in the inspection and sort of the site engineers and just missing things or not being educated as to what's important. So I know when I experienced this issue a little bit in Seattle, it wasn't because the site engineers, the inspectors, you know, were not sympathetic to it. It just was an issue of some education and priorities and that kind of thing. And so we came up with, for example, a one-page checklist, had a couple meetings with all these folks, the other city folks who did the inspections, and really resolved most of the problems. So it's that kind of follow-through that's needed.
And yeah, I mean, the asset management is a real key to knowing what you have out there and making sure that it gets put back. If curb ramps aren't being upgraded as part of resurfacing, unless there's some sort of other project that's coming through soon after, and those ramps have been added to a transition plan, legally speaking, those ramps are required to be upgraded. And I've worked in far too many communities that have been wrung through the lawyer's grip and paid out large sums of money, and now, you know, their process is very specific that they're upgrading their curb ramps as part of resurfacing. And so if it's just not happening in your community, you need to point to the ADA and the federal requirements associated with accommodating all users. The other thing that I will often see is when you're upgrading curb ramps to just say use a type 1 or type 2 and provide the generic detail, But then when you actually get out to construct it, you find out that it's not constructible as that style ramp, and you either end up with the contractor having to try and adjust the design or putting something in that is also not compliant. So making sure that the designs that you're proposing are actually constructible, not just necessarily providing the detail.
Mm-hmm. That's great. One question, and it gets to more of that idea that Pete, I think, introduced about taking your what you've been able to accomplish in resurfacing and move that toward more of a capital permanent project later down the road. And I wonder if Peter or Jeremy, you have recommendations if that's an agency's ultimate goal is to do that. Maybe they're thinking about a buffered bike lane that'll eventually hopefully become more of a separated bike lane with some kind of vertical element. Are there key pieces of data that you would recommend an agency when they first get that implemented be collecting to help bolster that argument down the road? Because I think all too many times you see agencies who don't do that before or after data collection and to demonstrate the value, and they don't have as much of an argument down the road where they want to make something permanent. Can you point out maybe a few things that you think each agency should be collecting to help evaluate those kinds of projects?
Well, two things. One is you should collect data that's related to your performance measures. And so if your performance measure is more bikes, you do a before and after. So I think you get that, you know, the data should be driven by the performance measures. And so you don't, because data collection and analysis and updating can be expensive, so be really focused on that. The other part of it, though, the question on the 6-year capital projects, I think this is where you really start thinking about complete streets, because you really have an opportunity to create a complete street on a bigger, longer-term capital project. And, you know, that's a whole nother conversation. But the Cliff Note answer is, you know, on any complete street project, I think you make a checklist. You have a scoping meeting very early on. You bring in everybody. You bring in the bike person, the ped person, the street tree, the folks, urban forestry. You bring in the transit folks. You really have a good conversation about, you know, what that street's going to look like, and I think that's where you can get that value under complete streets.
Jeremy, anything more that you want to add on to the sort of evaluation conversation?
I guess making sure that you're acquiring the before data as well. It's easy to forget that step, but you need a baseline in order to compare it to. And certainly, I mean, I view the facility types that can often be implemented as part of resurfacing as almost an interim condition, particularly when you're talking about separated bike lanes, because oftentimes that's limited to paint and flex post if you're lucky, and you know, ideally we're creating a lower stress environment with better physical separation than just flex post. So yeah, I mean, I like to have that before and after data with regards to bicycle usage, but even still realizing that until you create that higher quality facility that's lower stress, you're still probably not going to attract the same number of riders that you could. And it also ties back into the point about, you know, looking at what your project limits are and extending them another block if needed to connect to another facility. It's really hard to judge the effectiveness of implementing a bike facility on one road when it doesn't really connect to a whole lot yet. And so making sure that you have that in the back of your mind, that it's not going to achieve its highest ridership and see the most number of users until it's part of a more connected network.
That's great. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it actually, whether you intended to or not, is a great plug or a lead-in for the webinar we're going to be doing next week on thinking about multimodal networks as a whole and how we can, you know, be measuring connectivity, looking at things like low stress, and really think about how well we're doing in terms of providing what cyclists really need. So we're going to do that next week. I apologize that we didn't get through all the questions. We have to cut the discussion off right now. I hopefully provided you with a lot of good information in the chat pod, other links and resources as we've gone through. Please take a look at those. You can refer back to the slides. And again, we are going to be posting the recording from this session in just about an hour. I hope to have it up and available. So I wanted to let everybody know before you leave that you are going to be greeted by a brief survey after you've closed out. We would really appreciate your feedback and your comments on today's presentation. Let us know what we can improve and how we can do better in future sessions. We're always interested in your feedback. I just want to say thanks again, first to Becky Crow and those at FHWA for supporting this work and these great guides that you're putting out. And I want to thank Peter Lagerway and Jeremy Charzan for all the work you're doing on this and other efforts and the workshops that you're leading. And thanks for joining us today to take us through all this material. It was really valuable. And I finally just want to thank all of you for joining today's webinar. We hope to see you again next week. So thanks very much.